Hello and welcome back. This is my second video for this course. It's going to be a shorter one than last week. I just want to briefly go through the assignment for this coming week, and I'll be putting this up a little bit early because I'm going to be traveling for the next day or two, so I'll be I'll be in touch as much as I can, but I'll be flying transatlantic, so it'll be difficult to check in on emails and stuff like that. However, if there are any aspects of the assignment that you don't quite get, then let me know, because I am happy to clarify. And I realize, looking at the assignment now, that the instructions are quite extensive. Okay, really there are two assignments here, but they're really part of the same thing. So the first one is a close reading exercise. So you're going to work with a partner in your class. The partners are allocated in the discussion forum description for this week, which is the group close reading exercise presentation and feedback discussion forum. And you'll work with one other person. You'll pick a short extract from from Rochester's satire against reason and mankind, and you're going to close read those 20 pages in the context of the discussion of what satire can do rhetorically, that's laid out in Dustin Griffin's chapter, Rhetoric of Satire, Inquiry and Provocation. So this comes out of it was on the reading list anyway, but it feeds into a discussion that we were having in the introduction forum, where Jiri had mentioned that she's not convinced that contemporary satire on television and stuff like that is necessarily very effective, and that it may only be interesting to people who already agree with what people on TV like Jon Stewart or Stephen Colbert are saying, that if you already agree with them, you think it's great. If you disagree, you're not going to be persuaded by it. This has there's a long tradition in satire of having doubts about the efficacy of satire or the purpose of satire. There's plenty of examples from within our course of authors who regard satire as ultimately ineffectual, maybe ultimately pointless, and who sort of question the value of what they do. Now, Griffin doesn't necessarily make a defense for the persuasive power of satire. I think you can make that defense. I think that, for one thing, you can look at specific examples like the Modest Proposal by Swift, that did have a longer term effect on attitudes in England towards the Irish peasantry, and other examples like that, where over a longer period of time, attitudinal shifts can be detected. But that's my argument. Griffin points out that there are other potential rhetorical purposes than just persuading people. And so he lays out two in particular. One is the idea that satire is a type of inquiry, that it is calling ideas and moral values into question, rather than taking a single moral stance and then trying to persuade you to adopt that moral stance. Instead, it poses a problem or a possibility and inquires gradually into whether or not this is a correct moral stance, right? He gives a lot of examples of this type of satire, of the rhetoric of inquiry at work within satire. Probably the most compelling example he gives, or it's a series of examples of dialogues where these satires are written as conversations between two people who are both intelligent and both persuasive and well-informed in their own ways, who engage in a kind of Socratic dialogue with one another to try and arrive at a belief about a moral issue. And there's nothing in that form that suggests there's a single correct moral stance, and that in fact what a lot of satire is asking us to do is to make our own moral decisions, that it isn't a matter of telling you what to think, but rather to encourage you to think at all, and to think about and to make your decisions in a way that's intelligent and informed, right? The second type of rhetoric that he sees at work within satire is a rhetoric of provocation, and that is where somebody does not take a particular moral stance, but instead seeks to provoke outrage or disdain or disgust, or even just self-reflection, a willingness to look in upon one's own moral assumptions, right? And he argues that you can see that, and I mean, you can see this in any example of satire, I would argue, that it's often just deliberately provocative. It's trying to, in some way, shock you and maybe present you with some of the ambiguities of your own moral position. And again, A Modest Proposal by Swift is a good example of this, where people are sort of presented with maybe the logical extension of people's beliefs and assumptions about the Irish peasantry. And what he argues is that this type of satire doesn't necessarily have to take a moral stance of its own, that it may just be trying to provoke and or even poke fun at a particular moral stance without necessarily offering a particular alternative or a particular moral stance that it wants you to believe in. And this can often make it the target of criticism, you know, the idea that it's very easy to satirize something, but it's much harder to come up with a moral stance of your own. But what Griffin is arguing is that that type of provocation has its own purpose, that its purpose isn't to come up with an alternative, but rather to destabilize our moral assumptions about the world. And the final point, and it's kind of an extension in some ways of that idea of provocation, is the idea that satire is, well, first of all, satire is always ironic, right? Or nearly always ironic. It'll adopt a voice that is then sort of called into question or undermined or rendered ironic, right? I mean, the Colbert Report is a modern example. It's very typical. And actually, Modest Proposal is a fairly typical example as well, a sort of ironic speaker. But what he argues is that this type of irony is very unstable in satire, and particularly in early modern satire, that you can see the writer adopt an ironic attitude, and then that irony starts to get turned in every direction. You can see somebody like Rochester, for example, taking aim at the very people who might be most likely to agree with what he's saying, just as easily as he might make fun of his sort of opponents or his ideological enemies, right? So what that leaves us with is a sense that satire can destabilize in every direction. To take another modern example, I think South Park does this very clearly. It's there's no particular ideological point of view that ever sort of prevails in that. Rather, the sort of sense of irony and distance and ridicule is pointed in every direction and fired in a scattergun way. Okay, so those are the sort of alternatives to the rhetoric of persuasion that Griffin offers. So what I want you to do in this assignment is, when you read the satire against reason and mankind, you'll see Rochester begins by sort of stating he would rather be an animal, a beast of the field, than be a rational human being. And in some ways, partly because you'd be happier, but also because the idea of reason and rationality is in some ways hypocritical, or maybe not nearly as moral as we may take it to be. And so he's sort of calling into question some of the assumptions about human nature that we have, and some of the assumptions that the early modern period made about reason, and the notion that our sense of reason is innately a good thing or a sign of our civility or our civilization. Now, the question is, what would a satirist who's saying he would rather be a dumb animal, what's what stance is he actually taking there? It's very hard to see this as a satire that's trying to persuade somebody of anything, because we're not literally going to become animals without a sense of society or a sense of civilization or a sense of the sort of civilities that supposedly define us as humans. So the question becomes, what then is the target of the satire? And so in each group, group one, which is Laura and Alison, you're going to be looking at the poem as an example of the satire of inquiry. So it's like, in what ways is this poem engaging in a kind of inquiry into our moral position? Group two, which is Nicole and Meredith, you're going to be looking at it as an act of provocation, right? That see in what ways it attempts to provoke us to reflect upon, or maybe engage with, the moral assumptions that we make about the world. And finally, Jiri and Lisa are going to discuss this in relation to irony, and look at the ways in which the sort of ironic perspective of the text begins to be destabilized, begins to sort of work in multiple directions. Okay, so what you're going to do is you're going to read Griffin's chapter, and you're also going to read, excuse me, Rochester's satire against reason and mankind. The first thing you're going to do is, with your group, you're going to which is just two people, you're going to open a Google document, and you're going to each write in a different color, right? And you're going to discuss how the text embodies the rhetoric, the rhetorical aspect that you've been allocated. So group one will talk about inquiry, two will do the same thing with provocation, and three will do the same thing with unstable irony. This one, your other classmates won't see this document. It's a rough document. You can chat back and forth, come up with whatever ideas you have, ask one another questions, make suggestions. What I would say, though, is don't delete anything. Keep everything you've got. Keep it as a kind of dialogue between you, and suggest possible approaches to the text and your own thoughts in relation to the Griffin chapter, as well as the Rochester poem, and so on. You should do that conversation for about 3 days, right? During that time, you should also choose a particular passage of about 20 lines from the poem that you think best exemplifies the parts of the text you've been discussing. So if you're talking about the rhetoric of provocation, find a 20-line passage where you think you can really see that he's seeking a kind of provocation here. And that's going to be the focus of your discussion. You're going to work together to mine those 20 lines in as much detail as you can, right? You're going to like think about, well, what are the aspects of language that are at work within this? What kind of narrative voice is being adopted? What's the perspective? Are there any examples of sort of irony? What kind of imagery is he using? What kind of characterization? Can we tell what the author's intention is, right? As much detail and as much focus on the textual matter in front of you, the words on the page, rather than looking past it to try and see, well, what's the overall meaning of this text? We're going to look in considerable detail at a short passage of the text to get as much evidence to support our argument as possible. So you begin by talking in broader terms about your thoughts on the poem and its relationship to Griffin's ideas about the rhetoric of satire. But when you go to discuss it in more detail, you'll focus in on what those 20 lines that you've picked out have to say about this, right? I've given a whole list of possible questions you could ask one another regarding those 20 lines. There's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's 4 or 5 questions that you could ask, but you can expand that if you're interested in things like rhyme schemes and line layouts and stuff like that. Feel free to go into any kind of textual detail you want to think about how the language of the poem and the imagery of the poem and so on contributes to its satirical effect, right? When you're done with that, which you should be finished doing all of that by Thursday, and I would suggest that you should be doing it continuously from Monday through Thursday. Every day contribute something to that discussion. Send that on to me. It should be in the region of maybe 3 pages of discussion between the two of you. Just invite me to view the Google Doc or send me an attachment of it to my email or whatever. If you have been working together in a sustained and engaged way on this, and you're both really working hard on it, you'll both receive 50 points for that. You'll get a completion grade of the whole thing, okay? After you've done that, though, you'll need to allocate a role to each other, right? So one of you is going to be the presenter, and one of you is going to be the responder, right? So the presenter will write 200 words at least, summarizing your insights into the text and providing detailed textual support for your arguments, explaining what you guys talked about and what it was in your 20-line section that you thought was significant, what sort of close reading you carried out, in other words, and what benefits you got from doing it, anything that you think might be relevant to a class discussion of how this poem incorporates other rhetorics, other satirical effects, right? That's the presenter's role. The responder will then write 150 words at least in response to another group's presentation of their findings. So say group one, you have, who's group one again? Laura, let's say Laura is the presenter, and that means Alison is the responder. Alison will then write a response to group two's post, right? So they'll have put up a presentation, put up a post from their presenter, and you'll respond to that. You should build upon what they've said. You should provide alternative perspectives, identify points where their reading of their passage converges with or departs from your interpretation of the text. Essentially, you should be working with one another to think about ways that you can enhance one another's understanding of the poem, right? Then that responder will also write 50 words in response to the reply to their own presenter, okay? So you'll go back to your own group's thread and respond to the response, right? That'll be 50 words where you'll synthesize the interpretations made in the thread. You'll think about aspects of the discussion that you might find still to be confusing or things that you're uncertain about, areas that you still disagree about, and also areas where you can see that your discussion has led to new insights and built new modes of interpretation of the text, okay? So one person's a presenter, they just have to do that one post, 200 words. The responder then has to respond to another group's presenter, and they also have to close off the discussion on their own thread, okay? That's worth 20 points. I know it sounds a little bit complicated. It's really not that bad. These descriptions will also get shorter in later weeks because we'll essentially be doing these kind of group works in slightly different formats as we progress, right? Your grading for this will be the same as the grading rubric for a discussion forum, in that you will deal with critical thinking and inquiry will be one category worth 10 points. You know, how well you think about the text and inquire into it and provide textual support and so on. And secondly, that you'll have demonstrated engagement with others. In other words, the responder will probably have a lot more to do with that, how well you build upon what other people have said or offer alternative perspectives, right? The purpose of doing this the way we are doing is, first of all, to continue to build that idea of communal engagement with the text. Secondly, though, is that we're focusing much more on close reading. Now, this is going to be an assignment that will build towards our next, our future assignments, because you'll, by working very closely on an individual, on a small piece of an individual text, you learn to think very closely about what the text is doing in a very small space. And later you'll do an individual close reading assignment. You'll write a short essay that draws upon the same kind of skills or asks you to do the same kind of thing. And ultimately, that will help you to provide more detailed and more evidence-based arguments when you start to build your own final paper and your own video. Okay, so that's everything. This was a longer video than I expected it to be. I hope it's helpful, but as always, if there's anything that you're not sure about or not sure what to do, just get in touch with me, send me an email or whatever, and I will get back to you as soon as I can. Okay, thank you, and have a good couple of days. Like I say, I'll be a little bit out of touch tomorrow, Sunday and Monday, because I'll be on a plane. Okay, bye.